welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Today we're talking about the value of precision soil sampling. The purpose of today is to walk through on the FarmQA software side how you can accomplish the actual sample collection using our tools, and also to provide some insights from Agvise and Jody Bowe talking through the more specifics around the actual analysis and results. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest, which is Jody Bowe. Go ahead, Jody, and introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you, Ben, for having me. I'm an agronomist and certified crop advisor here at Agvise Laboratories. I'm based out of Northwood, North Dakota, and I provide technical and sales support to our customers across the prairie provinces of Canada and also Montana, North Dakota, a little bit of South Dakota, Northwest Minnesota. And I also farm with my dad and brother out in Western North Dakota.
Yeah, myself, Ben Munson with FarmQA. I'm a senior technology specialist here with the company. What that entails is doing sales and also customer support. I mostly spend a lot of my time connecting with agronomists and allowing them and enabling them to use our tool to better help growers. And I'm based out of Fargo, but we do have a reach throughout the Midwest and the country. So with that, we'll dive in. Jody's going to give us a walkthrough on some of so why sample, some examples around some specific fields, some results that they're seeing at Agvise Labs. I'll follow that up with walking through FarmQA and the software side of the collection. Jody will dive in a little deeper around interpreting results. And then I will say, I'll step back in with the FarmQA side and talk through how you can take the next step with that data, which might be prescription writing, zone creation, or a fertility plan. So that's what we'll cover today. And we'll throw it back over to Jody to talk through why you should be soil sampling.
All right. So why is it important to soil test? The first thing I like to show folks when I talk about the value of soil testing is this picture of some folks in a laboratory looking at soil. And I like this picture because that's what I think of when people say, well, I'm just going to fertilize based on whatever I feel like next year, or I'm going to fertilize even though I don't have a soil test. Because really, there's no way anybody can go out into the field, look at it and say, oh, this has X amount of residual nitrate, or this has this much phosphorus and potassium. What you need to figure out what's actually there in the soil bank is a soil test to figure out what you actually need for next year's crop. And so really, why do you go out and soil test your field? Soil testing is the best tool that's available for us to determine what nutrients are there in the field and what we need to add the next year to optimize crop production. Not only that, but by applying only what's needed, we can reduce the risk to the environment by over applying these fertilizers. And then of course, by doing that, only applying what we need, it helps us as producers save money by preventing over application and by optimizing yield and actually maximizing yields by not underproducing or under applying that fertilizer as well. And so just to really illustrate this, I've got a couple examples here of some of the dollars and cents and the value of soil testing. And so what this example of is here, I've got a soil test report that we put out here on the right-hand side. And this is an example of a grower in Northwest North Dakota. And so a little bit of history on this field. The agronomist for this field had called on some other question for this field, but had mentioned that this particular grower had picked up this piece of ground 3 years ago. And when they soil tested after picking up that piece of ground, there was over 300 pounds of nitrate in that field. In both the green, or all the green, the yellow, the red zones, every single zone had a ton of nitrogen. And it turns out the previous history of that field is a grower that had grown wheat on wheat on wheat for decades. And clearly by just applying whatever fertilizer he thought he needed without soil testing meant that soil test nitrate levels were through the roof when the new grower took over this field. And then not only that, that grower that was previously producing wheat on wheat on wheat would have not only saved money by cutting back on his nitrogen fertilizer, but he could have been using that to build soil test phosphorus levels. Looking at this particular report, all 3 zones for this field range from 5 to 7 ppm of Olsen phosphorus, which is In the mid-range, we consider anything over 15 ppm as the critical level for Olsen phosphorus. So really that producer could have soil tested and figured out they needed to apply less nitrogen and needed to apply more phosphorus. But moving to 2023, and this new grower, after sampling, previous slide. Long story. But with this new grower, after 2023, what they found is that there's still 154 pounds per acre of nitrogen left in this field. And so with current anhydrous prices, saving that 154 pounds per acre of N saves that grower $54 an acre in nitrogen savings alone. That's a whole lot of money. And when we think about the average cost of a soil test and sample at about $1.75 per acre, that's huge. You're getting a lot back in just a small investment and having that soil test and soil sample done. Now, next slide. And then this is an example from my own farm, more on the phosphorus side. But we picked up a piece of rented ground in May, so shortly after we were done planting. And because we picked it up so quickly and needed it planted right away, I decided that, you know what, I'm not going to soil test it. It'll be fine. I had assumed that these fields probably had not a whole lot of phosphorus left in them. So I put out 50 pounds of P2O5 across the board when spring MAP prices were really high. But unfortunately, when I soil tested this fall, and you can see one of those soil tests here on the right-hand side, my phosphorus levels were actually pretty high. So 24 ppm, that was pretty average across the field. In all actuality, I only needed to apply 10 pounds of probably 20 pounds of MAP across the field to get my optimum yield for this field. And so there's a little button now. What I could have done if I just paid for that $30 soil test, I could have saved almost $3,000 in MAP just by looking at that soil test.
Yeah, so with that, that's good reasons for why you should sample. So I'll step in and just explain a little bit on the FarmQA side. So a little bit more about our company. We are a software company, as I mentioned, based out of Fargo. We've been around since 2015, and we are focused on what we call a digital tool set for agronomists. And so with that, we have functionality around crop scouting, treatment recommendation writing in season, being able to do reports for growers based on cropping, crop plans. We can pull in imagery, but then we can also help them soil sample in the fall. So we're going to kind of hone in on that particular function within our software today. But if you're interested in the other suite, please contact us or see our website. But with that, we'll jump into actually a live demo, and I'll showcase how you can go about doing the actual boots in the ground sample collection with a software tool like ourselves. And then we have a direct integration to Agvise. And so I'll showcase that as well to illustrate how data can directly flow into the platform after sample is collected, sent to Agvise, processed, and then you could use it as an agronomist or grower to make those critical decisions, as Jody pointed out. Okay, so what you're looking at now is what we call FarmQA Controller. This is our web platform. And a few things that I will call out on this particular interface is simply how you can bring in existing data. So what we find is you may have our customers that are coming to the platform have existing zone maps. They may have existing sampling points that they want to return to, or they may want to start from scratch. So I'm going to attempt to kind of address all those scenarios here as far as setup goes within our software platform. So we are cloud-based, so this is simply a website that you can go to. And what we can talk through here is, let's say you have a field, and in this case, you may have existing grid sampling points you may want to add into the system. So to do this, you can click on the field and click on your soil sampling layer. So what you're seeing here is on the soil tab, we have the option to upload a data set. So if I click on this pencil icon, I'm going to pull up my Data Explorer on my computer. And in this case, I have a zip shape file that contains my pin locations. This can be a shape file. It can be a CSV with lat and longs of points that you've used in the past. But you can simply drag and drop them into FarmQA. That defines the points. You can choose which attribute to use as the name. So I'll choose sample ID, and I can then upload. So what we see is that contributes those points to that field. you can see the labeling appears as the sample ID. And at this point, we can take this to the mobile app and collect those samples, which I'll show shortly. If you have a zone map, we can do something very similar, but instead of pins, we can upload a map layer or an overlay. So I'll delete out my existing map. What I will do at this point is the same flow where I pull up my Data Explorer. In this case, I have a zone map and it's a shapefile, and I can drag and drop that into FarmQA. It will automatically style if it's coming out of ADMS or GK. Otherwise, you can manually style this to make it look the way you want as far as colors, as far as labels. So I can choose my attribute here to color on or show labels, and maybe I want my zone IDs to show up by default. So there is a bit of manipulation that can be done on when bringing in zones, but then they can look like what you're seeing here. In the same sense, we can bring in points on a zone map. So if you wanted to say, where do I pull my cores within the zones, you can define that and display, as you can see here, both zones and pins at the same time. So that may be a scenario where you're bringing in existing data. We can also talk through the scenario where you're starting from scratch. You're new to sampling and you want to maybe define points for the first time to return in future years. So we will talk through that, and to do so, I'm going to pull up my mobile application. So what you'll see here is the similar field that I uploaded the zone map to, and so we will talk through that scenario first. So on the mobile side, if I back one screen further, you can see a collection of fields on my screen, and from here, what I can do is I can search a field name, I can navigate, get automatic navigation to a particular field, or I could do something such as turn on township section lines to help myself navigate to a field. Once I get there, I can tap on that field boundary. I can enter into sample collection mode. So tapping on that boundary, one of our agronomic tools, as I described, is sample collection. So entering into that mode, I now have the option with the layer button on the right-hand side to turn on my zone maps, and I can also turn on my sampling points. So doing that allows me to now navigate within this field. So if I zoom in, if I was physically here, I would see a GPS circle move throughout the field, and I could then collect those samples as an overlay within that field. The same concept would work for my zone map, for my grids, rather. And in that case, you'd simply have a series of points, but they would obviously be in a grid formation opposed to the zone type setup. So that is the scenario to help you or to assist you when you have existing data sets. Hopefully that upload is straightforward, but then in the field, the navigation component is valuable as well. Talking through a few other scenarios, let's say you're starting from scratch. And so what you can do in a situation like that is you can either define grids within FarmQA, or you can, if you're doing composite samples, you can go to a field and simply mark where you've been. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use a field close to my office or where I'm at, and this will showcase a few other features that we have to offer on sampling. So if I wanted to sample this field called west of office, I have no prior data for that, whether it was zones, grid, or otherwise. So I'm going to use actually our work tab to showcase what you can do to create pins and then sample based on those. Our work system is if you want to dispatch work for yourself or to define across a team who needs to do what when it comes to sampling. We have different task types, so you could divvy this up between what needs to be composite sampled versus grid versus zone. If I were to click grid in this case, I can now choose my field. So I will say west of office as the field I want to grid sample. I can then define locations. So this is where in a planning phase, you can choose to define, let's say, a grid. So in my case, I want to define a grid, and typically your standard grid might be 2.5 acres. And so you can type in that density and you see the grid laid out within our software. In my case, I have a very small trial plot, so I'm going to go all the way down to maybe 1/4 of an acre just to showcase more pins. At this point, I can orient the grid layout within the field. I can change the actual rotation if you want this to align with how you're going to plant it or how it's tilled. You can do that. Once I'm happy with the alignment, I can commit that to the ticket. So it's saying, okay, we're going to sample in these locations. So I'm going to define that. This is optional, but I could say what depth are you going to sample? And this might be valuable in the case where you have somebody else sampling on your behalf. So you can say we need 0 to 6, 6 to 12 depth samples. You can put a start finish date in, or just one or the other. And then you can actually assign this to an individual in your team. So in my case, I'll assign this to somebody, and now I can put a note. So we'll say webinar example and create this task. So that is a scenario where I define the grid essentially, on the fly, and I can now immediately turn around and sample that. Within kind of along the way, I'll showcase this work feature. So if I was doing this, I can see all my tasks or purely the tasks that are assigned to me if I was part of a team. And then I could do things like search for a particular field. So I'll search for west of office. It's going to pull up that ticket. So it's saying it was created by me. It's assigned to Howard. It's you see the notes that I outlined, and I've collected 0% of the sample so far. If I click this right arrow, I now can see the field. I can navigate to the field. But what I wanted to showcase here is, since this field is close to me, we actually snap you to the nearest point. So it's telling you that I'm 181 feet away from the sample point number 13. And as I close in, that will be a dynamic number that shows you how far away you are at a given point in time. I can then use my location and I can scan a barcode. So if I was actually on a mobile device, iPads, Android devices, iPhones, I could scan an Agvise barcode, and that would pre-populate into this view. At that point, it would mark that sample as completed. So you can show progress as you go throughout the field, scanning barcodes. And so that's the grid scenario. And as you can see, it's snapping to the next logical point as you move forward. You can also, I won't have to do the controls on the web, but you can pivot the entire map. If you don't want north to be north, you could actually move that so it's aligned with your heading as you drive throughout a field. So that's another feature that's used when you're trying to get to a physical point in a field, which may be tricky in an open field without any reference. So that's the general flow, some of the functionality we have here. What you'll see if you're using a task is you can see your progress. So you're saying you're 13% complete throughout this field. And at this point, we can submit this and say we're done, or we can come back later. So I will submit this, and you could respond to a note either to yourself or to a superior to say, couldn't collect in west half, too wet. So that's optional, but then it's kind of tagging that along with that sampling event. So that's the flow of starting from scratch. You could do the same exact thing, but perhaps you are just doing composite sampling. So this might be perhaps the simplest scenario is we're going to go into this webinar field, and instead of creating a grid or bringing zones, anything like that, we're simply going to walk into the field, and we're going to drop pins with the intention of wanting to come back 12 months from now to those same exact spots for the precision concept. So I will go into sample collection mode with my shovel. Within here, I can simply tap. So that's going to use my device's location, and we go back to entering a barcode or simply just a sample ID. So maybe this is, you're doing zones, and you could say, well, Jody had the colors. So you could say red, you could say yellow, green. And then when we pull in the Agvise results, it can associate back to those pins. And so that's more free-formed, but as we do so, that's going to allow us to bring results back in and also reuse those points year over year to return to those locations. So those are some of the basic flows, and there are several different scenarios there. So hopefully that kind of encompasses what you are looking for as an individual collector. A couple other features I will point out that are quite handy is you can turn on your sampling points, but do it globally, meaning that I can see all my, I clicked the wrong thing, clicked on my sample points, but do it across my entire operation. So now I could see collectively across fields where all my sampling points are. You can also see a progress map. So going back to this concept of sampling as a team, if you use that task concept, and I zoom out here, you can see which fields are in progress, which ones are ready to be collected, and then back on the web, you can see which ones have actually been completed. So as a team, if you open up the app in the morning and say, where should I be going to be most efficient? You can simply navigate here to those fields. You can also filter this down to say, just show me my fields that are ready. So it's more or less cleaning up that map, and maybe you want to go to a different map mode to make that stand out. So that's just another nice tool that we offer, is to help you collectively saying, in what order should I collect? Where should I go to be most efficient? So that is how we can help you collect on the mobile side. We'll talk through how we can pull results back in, and then we'll hand it back over to Jody for interpreting results. So with that being said, we return to the web view. We've collected those samples and we can see them on the web. So let's just say we pull up a particular field and we can see our sampling points here. There's two ways you can actually get the results back into FarmQA. The first way is through our direct Agvise integration. So if I click on our soil tab and then labs, you can see here we have an Agvise button, and I could add a new key to this. And you can see I have my API key pasted into this particular enterprise or my account. To access that Agvise API key within the Agvisor portal, you can click on settings and then the API settings button, and that would provide that 20-digit key, which you can copy and then paste into FarmQA, and it will validate that in real time if it's a valid key. So if you're with Agvise, that's certainly recommended, as that will automate the data flow, meaning that the second that I scan that barcode in the field, that's all you have to do as a user. Once the data round trips through Agvise, we will automatically pull it back down and associate it to that point in our software. So it's a pretty elegant flow. We also support CSV imports. And so real quick, the way that works is you can create different import profiles. What that entails is you can drop in a CSV file, choose which of the CSV columns you want to bring into your FarmQA account, and then you do a one-time mapping of what those nutrients should be mapped to within our software, and you save that profile. At that point, you can click on a field or just do a generic bulk import by clicking on this circle button, choosing your import profile. You can choose at what level of your organization you're going to do an import, the growing season, the sample collection date, and then you can bulk drop CSV files in here. So from Agvise, you can get a bulk export of all your fields, maybe 100 fields worth of soil test results. You could drop in as a single CSV file, and FarmQA would bring that in looking for matches on your field name or whatever attribute you use as the common connector. If, let's say, you had 100 samples and 90 succeeded, 10 failed, we'll spit out the 10 failures and allow you to whittle that down and make corrections until all the data gets in. So those are the two methods of getting your results into FarmQA. But then as a result of that, you can then view the results in our software. So you can see that broken down with a map of where you collected, the sample results broken down by nutrient, and then the data over time as well, which we'll get to in the next segment. So with that, the data is now in FarmQA, but let's turn it over to Jody to talk through how you can interpret some of that data and make sense of it.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really cool to see through a lot of those features. I know as a soil sampler myself, and also our customers at Soil Sample, it's so nice having a platform that understands the soil sampling process. That makes collecting a lot easier, and also that data interpretation and just analysis a lot easier on the back end. But what I'm going to talk about now is just a little bit about thinking about interpreting results and things to look for the 2024 growing season. And the first thing I want to touch on is the fact that soil testing is regional. And so I might talk a lot about high pHs, calcium carbonates in soil, Olsen phosphorus, and residual nitrate, because those are really big factors for us here in the Northern Great Plains. They may not be so relevant to somebody in Missouri or the I-states because soil is regional. And so the point I want to make is make sure that you're consulting with a local expert, whether that be your local soil test lab, a university extension agent at your county or at the state level. Make sure that you're getting good data that is calibrated, or soil test results that are calibrated for your area, so that you're making the best guidelines for fertilizer the following year. So something I do want to talk about is probably the elephant in the room for this this cropping season for much of the Canadian prairies and also the Midwest, and that was the drought of 2023. And what I want to show is, really want to talk about, is what's going to be affected soil test wise because of the drought. And the first thing I'll talk about is soil nitrate. And so after these big drought years, what we typically see is that the residual nitrate levels do increase. And so why is that? Well, if you think about it, when we have a crop year with lower yield, there's going to be less uptake of the N that was applied as fertilizer in the spring. Those pathways that we typically think about where we can lose nitrogen from the soil, such as denitrification when water ponds, or leaching of nitrate from the root zone through water moving through the profile. We don't have as much of that during a drought year with less rain, obvious. And then sometimes too, what we can see is that in these warmer years where we have drought, it's typically a lot warmer, and sometimes we can see some more mineralization come about, leaving us with a lot of residual nitrate at the end of the year. And so what you see on the right hand of the slide here is some Agvise soil test summary data looking at residual nitrate levels fall in wheat from the years 1986 to 2022. And typically, on average, we'll see about 30 pounds of nitrate per acre after a wheat crop, but we see really big spikes after pretty very large droughts that we've had in 1988, then also in 2021. And so I expect for areas that did have very dry conditions this year, you will also see a bump in your residual nitrate levels. And so just to give a little taste of what we've seen so far, this is some summary of about 23,000 samples taken following the wheat crop this year from the Northern Great Plains region. And just to kind of illustrate that more, what I show here is just a little taste of what we have seen so far this soil testing season. What the data shown here is 23,000 samples that were collected after wheat. These are 0 to 24 inch depth cores, so nitrate at that 2-foot depth. And what you can see from this is that in the areas that were more dry, and so I point out here southern Manitoba and Manitoba in general, we are seeing more residual nitrate. And so on average, in Manitoba, we're seeing anywhere from 54 to 73 pounds of residual N after the wheat crop. And again, as you get into drier areas or areas that had more rain this year, you don't see as much residual N. Another thing I do want to point out here too is that in this table, what you can see is a variation in how many fields or what percentage of fields had what amount of residual N. And the point I want to make here is that things are variable. Just because an area or a region or an area has 73 pounds of N per acre does not mean that every single field has 73 pounds of residual N. So for instance, if you take a look over at the far right column here, one more click, you'll see that in southeastern Manitoba, 21% of fields or samples coming in from that region had over 100 pounds of N come back after the wheat crop. That's a lot of nitrogen. But at the same time, 26% of fields were coming back with 21 to 40 pounds of N per field. So the point is that things can vary from field to field. They vary within regions. It's really important to get that residual nitrate value from your field, and especially this year after such dry conditions that we had, so that you can credit that and count that towards your 2024 nitrogen budget. I do want to talk a little bit about depth. I know different areas have different, I'd say, depth norms. And I want to talk about why we recommend here in our lab doing a 0 to 24 inch depth sample. And so what those two depths will break down to is a 0 to 6. So 0 to 6 will have everything tested on it, and then that 6 to 24 inch depth will have your mobile nutrients plus pH and salts also tested on it. But the reason that we recommend that 2-foot depth is that that is a depth that accounts for or can explain most of the plant nitrogen uptake the following year. And so the table you see on the side, on the right-hand side of the slide here, this is some research that was done in southern Manitoba. And what they found is that that 2-foot depth has the most explanatory power out of any other depth in determining what the next year's N uptake is going to be. Again, because we're here in the Northern Great Plains, we talk a lot about residual nitrate because as soon as soil freezes, there's no more leaching, there's no more denitrification, and that nitrate's going to be available for the crop the next growing season. But for those of you that are listening in maybe the I-states or southern Minnesota, I do have some more implications for you from nitrate in a little bit too. So don't stop listening. We'll cut you in a little bit as well. And here they are. What are the implications besides just being able to account for residual nitrate in your nitrogen fertilizer budgets the next year? One thing that we do know of having high residual N levels is that it can exacerbate IDC incidence. And so for you folks in southern Minnesota, Iowa, if you have IDC and you're going into the 2024 growing season and you know you've got fields that typically do have IDC in soybean, it's going to be really important to realize what your residual N level is and how that can affect IDC incidence. And so what we know is that when you have really high levels of residual N, it does make IDC worse. So keep that in mind as you're going into 2024 and really think about what your residual levels are and then also what type of IDC tolerance you can get with your soybean variety that you're choosing for these fields. One other implication I do want to talk about as well is that if you are someplace that has been really dry and you have a large amount of residual N, it's important to keep that in mind if you are testing a product or trying a product that claims that it's going to create N for that growing season. Like I showed before, there's many fields after just wheat crops here in the Northern Great Plains that are ending up with over 100 pounds of N per acre. And so I would expect similarly for areas that had a lot of dry conditions and if they stay dry throughout the winter and the spring, you're going to have some residual N. And so just keep that in mind as you try products that are claiming that they are adding N to the system. It's really important to know what you already do have in the system because after drought, it's a good chance that you do have residual nitrogen there. A couple other things I want to talk about, potassium, and this is another nutrient that's affected by drought. You may have noticed this summer, especially like in late July, early August, that you were seeing fields of corn or soybeans that were experiencing potassium deficiency. Right, so we think about potassium deficiency in corn as occurring on those lower leaves and then showing necrosis around the edges. This is really common in drier years and in fields that are testing kind of at around the area of the critical level. They might even be above what we consider the critical level for most areas in North Dakota is 160 ppm. For areas that have higher smectitic clay or a higher amount of shrink and swell clay, that critical level is even higher at 200 ppm. But if you're around that area and it's dry, there's not enough water for the potassium to move from the soil to the plant roots. And so we can sometimes see potassium deficiencies in dry years. And so what does this mean on the soil sampling side? It's really important to keep in mind, okay, some of that K just isn't going to be in the soil solution to take up. And then say if you've just harvested your cornfield, or any of your fields, it's important to keep in mind that when we're taking off the grain of any crop, if we're just taking the grain, we're not taking much potassium from that field. Most of that potassium is left in the stalks, in the leaves, and the residue, and that recycles back into the soil as rain falls and leaches that K out. However, if there's been no rain after harvest, there's been no chance for that K to get back into the soil. And so you might notice after dry years, you're seeing a little bit lower soil test potassium levels. So it's important to keep that in mind and take that with a grain of salt for next year and maybe look at previous year soil test K history to inform those 2024 guidelines moving forward. And so the last thing I want to talk about regarding interpreting soil tests in a dry year like this is also soybean cyst nematode. And so many of you listening are probably dealing with this at some level. If you haven't already tested your fields for what that SCN population is, you should, especially if you grow soybeans. If you grow soybeans, you really should be testing for this pest. But do keep in mind as you're looking at those results, the conditions that really drive SCN egg production are high soil pHs. So for us in the Northern Great Plains, we have a lot of those soils that have high pHs. Another factor is soybean on soybean rotations. So having a host crop followed by another host crop of SCN, soybeans on soybeans, is going to drive that egg production up. And also, side note here too, field beans are also a host for SCN. And then finally, another big condition that helps and really favors SCN egg production are dry soil conditions. And so if you've been keeping track of your SCN egg population in fields, you might notice that when you get your result back this year, it's really, really high. And that's likely because conditions were very favorable for those eggs to produce this year. So keep that in mind as you're going into 2024 and you're thinking about at the end of the 2024 growing season, why are some of these soybeans not producing like they should? Take a look at your SCN egg population and see if that has really exploded over the past year. And so our Benson laboratory in Southwest Minnesota is the one that does all these counts. So we do that here at Agvise as well. And we do see quite a few fields that come in from that 2001 to 10,000 eggs per 100 grams of soil. And we do see fields that come back over 10,000 as well. So it's something that you should really keep your finger on and know what is present for SCN in the soil.
Okay, thank you, Jody. That was excellent. So we're going to jump back in on the FarmQA side. So where I left off was we had brought data into the software. We'll talk through what you can do with that next. And so some of the things that Jody was referring to is kind of trends on drought years. So that's a good thing that we can showcase kind of your trend levels on different nutrients over time and maybe zoom in on your particular fields across your growing area and see how you might be impacted. And then we can also showcase how you can take your soil data and take action as far as coming up with a fertility application plan. So with that, I'm going to jump back into our web platform and showcase a few additional things. Okay, where we left off was I had talked through how we can bring soil data back into FarmQA, either via the API from Agvise or CSV. Once that data is in, you can see it in a couple different ways. One way is the screen you're looking at now. So I have a single field selected called zone field. I have my results in over time, and I can see kind of roughly how it's trended over the years. And so I've got 3 years worth of results in here, and you can see the results based on different depths. You can do things like if you just want to look at maybe the totals over time, you can filter down to just seeing that data and filter that by years. So you can see in a data table how that's changed over time. You can pivot that data to look at your management zones based on the different nutrients. And then you can see the raw data that's come in here as well. But from there, some additional things, we try to provide you a lot of the critical information to make decisions on one screen. And so with that, you can see your application history. So if you want to look at what did you apply in a particular season, and then how did the sample respond as far as the results go. You can look at your yield history. So if you're trying to come up with a yield goal for the following season, you can see how a particular field yielded, but more specifically how it benchmarked to other fields of the same crop. So in this case, if we pick an example, you can see the beets in this case. You can see where they benchmarked versus the lowest was 28, the highest was 39, and you can see how that kind of fell that season. Additionally, we give you a look over time as well. So if you want to look at those nutrients that we're seeing, you can choose to chart that over time. So you're looking at, in my case, nitrogen over seasons, and you can see that data broken out in this way. So that's one thing you can do. You can also, if we go back into maybe the grid field, you can see from this screen, we have a lot more points, a lot more data, but you can optionally break this into zones if you want to do variable rate applications. And so the way this works in our system is you can see the results across the entire field. You can choose what nutrient to display. So maybe we want to jump over to potassium, and you can see in a bar chart where that data fell as far as the number of samples within each data range. And then you can see if you had an outlier in a situation like this, you can choose to remove some of those outliers from your zones. So by me unchecking those, that will exclude them from our data set. But what we can do here is we'll give this a name. We can choose how we want to group or cluster that data that we have. You can set a minimum zone size. So we'll say maybe a 1/15 of an acre, the number of zones you want, and then you can preview that data. So it will take this potassium data, it will break it into like-minded zones, if you will, grouped by the data. From here, we have some edit tools. So if you want to perhaps dissolve some of these zones down and do some manual edits, you can adjust that. You can also break this into a grid. So let's say, when you apply, you might want to be on 50-foot grids. You can take that data, maybe I'll go to 80-foot grids and break that apart. It will take these same zones, but it will slice it into that grid. And that then also gives us more granularity when it comes to editing. So if I wanted to make some fine-tune edits to my zones, I can now do that based on those grids. So that's a component of what we offer. And then from here, you can create that zone and also jump into a prescription. So if you wanted to now write a urea prescription based on your Agvise gridded soil data, you can now enter in, you can see your zone map. So maybe on the low zones, you might want to put 250, and on the high, you might come down to 100. And then we can autofill on those zones. So it'll give you a breakdown of, first of all, your potassium range, the number of acres that fall within a zone or percentage-wise as well, and then your product total per zone, along with more or less a load sheet across that entire field. So from here, you could download that and you'd get a shapefile of that prescription, as you can see down here, and then that would be something that you could upload into an applicator. Additionally, you can select multiple prescriptions. So if you have multiple different applications across the field, you can select those and you can export that into a bulk shapefile, but also get a bulk load sheet as well. So doing this generated one shapefile that had 3 fields in it, which you can see here. And so the naming convention would be the field and the application type, but you can also view like a PDF load sheet as well of all those fields combined. And so doing that, you could pull up something like this where you can see the zones plus the load sheet, the product totals, and move on to your next field and continue to view those. So that's a way you can view that data, but also create zones and prescriptions. Additionally, if you want to simply look at the data, but over time, so I mentioned that earlier, we'll dive a little deeper into that. A way we can do that is by viewing the points, the data on the fields. And if I go back into season where we have sampled, I can then see that data by point. So I can click and see the results by location, but I can also see that data over time. So like I mentioned in the previous screen, we also referenced that trend line data at the map level. So if you want to move around and to kind of navigate field by field, but see what's going on nutrient wise, and maybe ammonia is a bad example, but if you want to look at a nutrient that you're trying to impact over a longer period of time, you could view that and see the trend line. Then if you want to take that one step further, you can start to look at your soil data, but across all your fields. So if you want to look at that in, let's say, a data table, you can get a row per field, and you can do things like group this by crop. So if I wanted to see, show me all my lab results, but grouped by corn, for example, I could now see, well, here's all my potato fields, my soybean fields, and we'll provide average values in those set groupings. And you can also highlight a cell to get that trend line over time. Then if you wanted to chart that out and look at something like your nitrogen levels by crop over time, you could see a chart like this. So there's a lot going on, but you can see that this is that same trend line that we looked at of looking at results over time, but you can then compare that across fields. So if you wanted to determine why field A versus field B maybe yielded differently, or how it's being treated as far as applications and what kind of impact that's having, we have quite a few tools to allow you to do that. And within here, we won't go too deep within the analytics tools, but there's a lot of levers and dials that you can turn to create graphs and charts that are looking more across time at a data set. And then you can save those out as a dashboard, so it's more easy to consume when it comes to looking at results across fields and which fields might need more attention or less. Like Jody mentioned earlier, in what field, if looking at the results, could have resulted in maybe a decision in saving on a particular product. But then you can also see things like showing the data spatially over time, how levels or trends in a particular nutrient might be changing over time. So with that, I mean, there's a lot to the analytics tools, and we don't need to use up our time going too deep into that, but just showcasing the trend line type data sets that you can generate by backfilling your Agvise data into FarmQA and helping you make more informed decisions for the future. So with that, I'll also showcase and kind of end on this, is if you want to then write a prescription or a flat rate recommendation, you can then do that in FarmQA by combining products. So maybe urea and potash with different pounds. You can then do that per field and then generate a PDF for an applicator, for yourself, for your records, to showcase what needs to be applied on each field. And then we would also give you a roll-up total across all the fields of what was applied or what needs to be applied. So total tonnage across your given inputs. So that's how you can bring the data in, visualize it perhaps over time or within a particular season versus a yield goal, but then also turning that into maybe a recommendation or an application itself within the software. So with that, we'll wrap up. I'm going to jump back to my slides. Okay, so with that, we appreciate you tuning in. You can see our contact information is listed on the screen, and both Jody and I would appreciate it if you have questions to reach out, either with a call or an email. But with that, hopefully you found this insightful, learned something about FarmQA software, and also some insights around fertility levels from Jody and some trends that we're seeing regionally here. So with that, we'll sign off, and I will throw it over to Jody one last time to add any comments that she might want to add.
Thank you very much, Ben, for having me today. It's been a pleasure being able to share some of our insights from the 2023 soil sampling and testing season. We're still in the midst of it, so we're excited to share more later on this winter. But thanks again for having me, and let me know if you have any questions.